Retired Australian General Mick, supporter and friend of Ukraine, military strategist, analyst, and author, joining me now. General Ryan, welcome.
Hi, Natalie. It's great to be with you again.
It's always a pleasure. So, General Ryan, yesterday, Putin claimed that Ukrainian drone and missile strikes on Russian territory do not affect the situation on the battlefield. At the same time, he keeps speaking as if Russia is steadily succeeding militarily, even though many analysts do not see any kind of a breakthrough Moscow keeps suggesting. So why does Putin seem to believe in battlefield successes that is not really there, that it doesn't exist?
Well, we know pretty much every time Putin opens his mouth about the war in Ukraine that he's lying. But he has to lie because his military just have not been as successful as he'd hoped. And he has to tell the Russian people a story that will justify the 1.5 million casualties that they've suffered in this war. That's one of the ways that he hopes to keep his job.
And okay, what is the Kremlin's real bet in this war right now, at this stage, this summer?
Well, at this point, Russia's losing the war. They have not made any progress in their spring offensive of 2026. They've been going backwards. And what we've seen as a result of that is Putin is having to push back yet again his date for securing all of the Donbas. I think the Ukrainian president in the last 24 hours has described 15 successive dates set by Vladimir Putin for the capture of the Donbas. It's very unlikely that the Russians will meet even the latest date set by the Russians, which is December this year.
Yeah. And, Ukraine is trying right now to do two very difficult things at once: hold the front and systematically strike Russia's military system in depth, fuel infrastructure, logistics, occupy Crimea, targets deep inside Russia. What does that tell you about the current phase of the war?
Well, I think what we're seeing this year is Ukraine has increased the effectiveness of its military operations at multiple levels. It's increased the effectiveness of its defensive operations. We see this by it essentially halting the Russian ground offensive, notwithstanding small infiltrations at different places. We see it by the mid-range strike operations, which range out to about 150 kilometres, really hurting Russian logistics. And we see it by the increase in strategic strike on oil refineries, on defence industrial targets, and on Russian air defence. And the thing is, Ukraine is synchronising all these as part of its war strategy. So at every level, Ukraine has upped its performance this year, and it's really shifted the momentum of this war.
Good. But, we've all seen the videos, and you probably also, of Russians standing in long queues at petrol stations. They are complaining that they cannot drive, fill their car, go to occupy Crimea for a summer holiday. As a general, when you watch those scenes, do you see a minor inconvenience or a sign that the war is beginning to enter, Russian daily life, and it can shift the mood inside Russians?
Well, I think it's certainly shifting the consciousness of Russian people, but I don't know that they really have too many pathways to change the course of the war because of that. Just because they don't like it doesn't mean they can do anything about it. Putin and his henchmen have really locked down the security of Russia in a way that even the Soviet Union never did. And an individual's capacity to change politics in Russia is very, very minimal indeed.
Yeah, true. They will always adapt. I think this is just, their usual state of mind when it's an imperialistic country. General Ryan, Putin acknowledged fuel problems. He just gave the interview and he said, yes, we do have them. But he insists they have no impact on the battlefield. If they do not matter militarily, why does the Kremlin have to talk about them publicly on camera?
Well, I think he has to admit that there is something going on that isn't in Russia's favour, because you can't ignore the hundreds of drones that are heading into Russia every single day from Ukraine. You can't ignore these very significant strikes on different oil refineries and drones flying over Moscow. I mean, you just can't cover that up. So he has to acknowledge it somehow. But at the end of the day, Putin retains his maximalist objectives for Ukraine, which is to subjugate Ukraine. He has not moved from that. It's just that he's less likely than ever to achieve that.
Yeah, you're right. You cannot ignore. You have to admit. I was reading the latest analytics from the Institute of the Study of War, when they were saying that Putin cannot ignore it, but at the same time, this strikes is still not enough for him to admit it's hurting a lot to Russia. Do you think so?
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's always good analysis from Institute of Study of War. I mean, what Putin is doing is telling his own story of what these Ukrainian strikes are and the impact. He's certainly not telling the truth. He would never do that. But he's manufacturing a story around what these Ukrainian drones are doing in Russia, just as he's manufactured a story since the beginning of the war of inevitable victory. And we know that's not possible.
General Ryan, last time we were discussing with you Crimea, and we agreed that Russia, we will not get back Crimea in a visible future. Well, what could be potentially next steps for the Ukrainian armies? For the Ukrainian army, how do you see the situation will elaborate?
Well, certainly the Ukrainian armed forces and the intelligence services are doing a pretty good job of isolating Crimea at the moment, cutting off a whole range of logistics going into and out of Crimea, but also destroying energy and other services there to make life there pretty unbearable. I don't know that will change Putin's calculus. It may mean he'll lash out even more. And we should really think, is this a key effort for Ukraine to take back Crimea, or might it be a major deception effort to distract us from looking elsewhere, where Ukraine might decide to do offensive operations later in the year?
You know, General Ryan, I'm always thinking that Ukraine is now striking military infrastructure deep inside Russia, sometimes more than 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. And frankly speaking, for years, Western capitals treated this almost as a, forbidden idea of us striking that deeply, as if Russia had the right to wage war from its own territory without being hit back. You know that. Why did it take so long? Almost 5 years. Okay, no, less. 4 years. Why did it take it so long for the world to accept that obvious what the aggressor's territory cannot be untouchable in a war they have started?
Well, I think early in the war, and we both remember when even providing artillery to Ukraine was seen as escalatory and crossing a red line. I think there were some who thought that Putin and Russia might still be reasoned with if the damage to them wasn't too much. I think we've conclusively proven that is not right, and that Russia absolutely has to lose this war and be seen to lose this war. I think European politicians have finally come to that conclusion that not only Ukraine's security, but their own security is tied up in Russia losing this war.
Where is this line between strikes that hurt and strikes that begin to shape political decisions in Moscow?
Well, countries are very resilient things, and whether they're authoritarians or democracies, we know that strategic bombing campaigns can have an impact on political thinking, but they're rarely decisive by themselves. So this very successful long-range strike campaign in Ukraine really needs to be coupled, as it is being coupled, with success on the battlefield and success in mid-range strike, and importantly, success in diplomacy in the United States and in Europe to convince them to continue to support Ukraine and put even more pressure on Putin through sanctions and other means.
Yeah, you're right. I was reading that recently President Zelensky, he said that since the start of a full-scale invasion, Russia has already set 15 different deadlines, 15 different deadlines for capturing Donetsk region. Each time Moscow failed and simply moved the deadline again. Is Russia still pursuing a realistic military objective in Donbas, or Donbas has become a political obsession for Putin?
I think it's a political obsession, but they're not setting realistic timelines. Remember back to the first day of the war when Putin thought 3 days Ukraine would fall, 10 days Ukraine would fall. The Russians have set a successive number of deadlines, not just about the Donbas, but about the war completely, and they've never met them. They've never even come close to achieving the vast majority of them. They're unlikely to achieve this latest deadline of 2026 that Putin's just set.
And Russia keeps advancing slowly at an enormous cost. Is this still a strategy, or has the method itself become the strategy?
Well, I think that it is the only way they can move forward. The large-scale manoeuvre of brigades and battalions just isn't possible on the front line at the moment. So infiltration is about the only way that Russia can gain any success, but it's extraordinarily slow, and still the majority of Russian troops are killed in that process. Ukraine has adapted its tactics to cope with how the Russians are infiltrating. So this is not a successful long-term strategy. It's a coping strategy to make it look like Russia might be making some gains, but it's not actually.
Not actually. General Ryan, Alexander Lukashenko, self-proclaimed president of Belarus. He met Putin, and then almost immediately he traveled to China. And their meeting also ended without a joint press conference, which is unusual. I mean, Lukashenko and Putin. No press conferences. This is unusual for Russia-Belarus relations. How would you read that, everything? And the trip to China as well, just immediately after trip to Valdai.
Well, I think that Lukashenko is hedging his bets about the outcome of this war, and that if Russia loses, he's going to need a new patron. And the only person who's likely to pick up that is President Xi of China. So he's really hedging his bets. He's also saying to Putin, hey, I have other options here, so can you back off a little bit? Because he knows that if he was to engage in direct conflict with Ukraine, the Ukrainians would make him hurt to an enormous degree that he might even lose his job.
So is Minsk trying to create more room for maneuver between Moscow and Beijing, or is China simply becoming harder for both Russia and Belarus to ignore?
Well, it's both those things, but I also think Lukashenko is pragmatic enough to understand that if he was to step up the support of Russian operations, or even commit Belarus troops for operations against Ukraine, they will certainly lose. There's almost no doubt about that. And if Belarus was to suffer a significant military defeat at the hands of Ukraine, Lukashenko would probably lose his job.
Do you think we should be in Ukraine, we should be afraid that something will come from Belarus to our territory, some aggression?
Well, right since day one of the war, Ukraine has been prepared for that. And remember the advance on Kiev, a lot of that originated from Belarus. So this is something that Ukrainian military strategy has always been prepared for. It has an entire command focused in that direction. I just think that Belarus has been a less willing participant in this war than Russia has been, and it certainly has far more to lose in this war than even Russia does.
Okay. But do you think Putin is trying, the reason why they didn't have any joint press conferences, that Putin is trying to still drag Belarus more deeply into the war against Ukraine, not just using there as a platform, as a territory for launching their missiles and drones?
No, absolutely. Putin would like to have more Ukrainian forces deployed to the north to get them out of the Donbas so he can achieve some of his objectives there, or get them out of the south where Ukraine is also making some progress. So this is, something that has military objectives to force Ukraine to focus more on the north, but also ensure that Belarus is tied more tightly to Russia.
General Ryan, you have just returned from the History Festival in Britain, where you discussed Ukraine, China, Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific and artificial intelligence, I was reading, and global security with the senior military leaders and strategists. After those conversations you had, does the war in Ukraine look increasingly like part of a wider global strategic contest?
Absolutely. Ukraine has never really been an isolated conflict that was just about Eastern Europe. It is about security in Europe as well. Obviously, the most important objective in this war is retain Ukraine's sovereignty and then establish a post-war construct where Ukrainian sovereignty is protected and guaranteed. But it's about European security. But it's also about, more broadly, defending democracy. And that is something that we all need to engage in, whether we're in the Pacific or in Europe or elsewhere in the world. So Ukraine has relevance not just to Eastern Europe, not just to Europe, but to many countries around the world.
And as far as I understood from that conference, that one of the big questions today is whether the United States can manage Russia, China, Iran, North Korea at the same time. What does that mean for Ukraine if Washington has to divide its attention among so many threats?
Well, I think we're already seeing that manifesting. The most recent national defence strategy from the United States of America talks about the priority being the Western Hemisphere and then the Pacific, and Europe is after that. We've seen the redeployment of American forces from Europe. And the Trump administration has been very open about Europeans having to do more in their own backyard with their security. Now, Europe's economy is much larger than Russia's. Its military forces are much larger. That is, I think, something that America can logically say to Europeans you can and should step up more. The Pacific is different. China is an order of magnitude more difficult for regional countries like Japan and Australia to deal with, and American support there would be far more decisive.
Mm-hmm. And okay, General Ryan, after speaking with the generals, historians, strategists in Britain, what was your strongest impression? Is Europe really preparing itself for a long war, or is part of it still hoping to return to the world before 2022?
I think in their quieter moments, many politicians would hope for a return to 2021, but I think just about everyone understands now that world is gone. It is not coming back. The pace of the shift in thinking in politicians and senior military leaders is probably not as fast as we would like, certainly not as fast as I'm sure President Zelensky would like, but it is occurring. We are seeing different countries allocate more of their national wealth to defence spending, expanding the size of their militaries, deepening ties with each other as well as with Ukraine, deepening industrial collaboration and production of different systems. We've just seen in the last 24 hours, Ukraine and Denmark talk about developing anti-ballistic missiles. So we're seeing a very significant shift from the post-Cold War security environment. I think we just all like to see it move a bit faster than what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Retired Australian general, military strategist, analyst, author, and friend of Ukraine, Mick Ryan was with me online. Thank you so much, General Ryan.
Thanks, Natalie.